If you're shooting a photo or a video, or even thinking about how a painting should look like, the first thing you should think about is the distance. The distance between the camera and the subject. And the subject doesn't necessarily need to be a person, it could be an object or something you want to focus on. And the distance between the subject and the camera will mostly determine the feeling and what the viewer can see. There are essentially three types of shots at three different distances: wide shot, medium shot, and close-up shot. Wide shots establish the setting. Well used, it can portray the feeling of loneliness or awe, but we'll go there in just a second. Medium shots are the normal ones, what you're seeing right now. It balances the focus on the subject and the surrounding environment. Neither too distant or too intimate, it feels natural and relatable. And close-up shots capture emotions and details that are important to the story. So easy, right? There are three types of shots, and if you want to think more on the compositional side of things, we have to divide the frame into two parts. The area of the subject is called positive space, and in contrast, the area outside the subject is called the negative space. How much of each space occupies the screen will mostly determine the feelings that the viewer might have while watching. What emotions come when you watch this one? Here I'm just walking from left to right to the beach. You see that I'm pretty distant from the camera, so it's a wide shot, and the positive space is very small compared to the negative space all around me. It makes the shot feel lonely. So frames where there's little positive space and a lot of negative space might feel lonely, but doesn't need to necessarily feel that way. It all depends on the context. If we take a look at this one, we see that I'm even further away from the camera. So the positive space is even smaller, and most of the frame is actually occupied by the negative space. But when you watch it, the feeling is different. It's not so much as loneliness, but a feeling of awe. And that's mostly because of context. Even though in the first example, there was not much to it, the sky was more monotone, my body language showed more loneliness in a way. Whereas in the second example, we see that I'm directly looking at the sky. The sky is more colorful opposed to the first one. And just this simple act of observation makes it feel that all this negative space will contribute to the vastness and the awe factor, the surprising factor that this shot gives. So these are two examples where you see a lot of negative space, but very little positive space. So let's take a look at the opposite right now. So this shot, you see the subject isn't a person, it's a clock. And it's so close to the screen that it occupies 100% of the frame. It leads to seeing a lot of detail. We're focusing so close. And if it used correctly, we can show the feeling of chaos or sensory overload. So the proximity of the clock to the camera plus the sound effects really add up to the overload, the stimulus of chaos. But again, it's all about the context. These close-up shots don't always necessarily need to feel chaotic. If used correctly, it can also reveal intricate feelings and details that you would never see in wide shots or medium shots. Faces show a lot of emotion, and by having a really close-up shot, it creates a good sense of connection. Isn't it fascinating? By just tweaking the distance, we can change so much of the feeling that the viewer will have while looking at it. Next time you're shooting, taking a video, or just drawing, think about this one. Think about the distance. What feelings do you want to portray? If you haven't tried so, try mixing them up. Maybe a wide shot to establish the scene, or a close-up shot to really show detail. With that said, best of luck. This is something that I decided to include because I thought many don't actually fully understand it. In this lesson, we will focus the effects of shooting all the way zoomed out to all the way zoomed in, and what effects it does to our image at the end. Let's pretend this is our subject. This is the thing we want to shoot. The shot you're looking at right now is the camera with the zoomed all the way out. And as we slide the camera further away, I'm going to slowly zoom in to make the subject have the same size in the frame. Can you notice the background getting more and more compressed? These are physical optical properties that you can try even with your phone. To experiment, you can place an object that you want to take a picture, and you first want to take a picture with your ultra-wide lens. Then switch to your normal lens. You'll notice that with the normal lens, you need to go a little further away to have the object at the same size in the frame. If you swipe between the two pictures, can you see the difference of the background? You'll notice that the ultra-wide lens captures a lot of the background, whereas the zoomed-in lens or the normal lens will compress a bit more. You'll see less of what's on the background, and it's more focused on the subject. People quickly think that, oh, wide shots are better or the zoomed in shots are better, but they have their differences and they're used for different occasions. So a wide lens makes spaces and environments feel larger, often evoking an awe or sense of openness. This is why it is used for landscapes or dramatic architecture shots. This is especially helpful when the space is limited and we want to use the ultra-wide lens because we cannot go physically further away back. Or in the case you want a nice wide establishing shot, having an ultra-wide lens makes it easier to capture one. You don't have to go so further away. Now, if you zoom all the way, the background is so compressed, the focus isn't about what's around the subject. Instead, the subject is the main focus. For example, on this shot in Portugal, I wanted to capture the train going from the right to the left. That's the subject. And because the background didn't really matter, I zoomed all the way in, compressed the background as maximum as possible. And as you can see around this area, you really just see a blur. Meanwhile, the subject is the only thing in focus. So remember, the smaller the focal length of your lens, the wider the shot, the more of the background it captures. The longer the focal length, the more zoomed in it is, and the more it compresses the background. I actually learned this when I was taking a picture in the mountains, and you can see the first picture here. I had a lens that was all the way zoomed in and it compressed so much the background, all you can see was this tiny part. So I switched the lens to a wider one and the difference is night and day. The first picture was unusable, but the second one was perfect. You could see much more of the background and the picture turned out beautiful. I hope you got to understand what the focal length does, zooming in or out, and what uses it does and what does it do with the background. If you haven't done so, maybe you have a spot where you usually take pictures. Try taking pictures with a different focal length. Maybe you're used to taking wide pictures. Maybe try all the way zoomed in. You just have to take a few steps back and see the difference in the results. With that said, best of luck. Now that we have set the distance between the camera and the subject, the next step is how do you frame it? You could frame like this, a bit to the left, a bit to the right, a bit more zoomed in or out. How do you know where in this frame you'll have your subject? When me and my friends were at the beach, we saw this person with this huge camera and we wanted to take a group picture just for memories. So I asked him to take a picture and this is the result. And honestly, I didn't dare to ask another picture, but I was kind of disappointed. The framing was not the best. I understood what he was trying to do, but in the context, it just didn't make sense. And fun fact, I actually explained to them why this picture wasn't so good because they couldn't understand. And this whole explanation sparked the idea of actually creating this whole composition course. So in order to position your subject within the frame, there are in the camera settings these guidelines that might be helpful. In the camera, there should be a setting to change what type of grid you would like to use. And the most common one is the rule of thirds. It divides the frame into 3 by 3 equal rectangles. Basically 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical ones. And it creates 9 equal sections of area with 4 cross points. The idea is to place your subject or important elements along these lines or at the intersection instead of centering them. This creates a more visually pleasing and a more balanced composition. Let's take a look at a few examples. So let's add the rule of third grid. So can you see? Where I'm biking right now in the fog, I'm biking throughout the line of the bottom horizontal rule of thirds guide. If you were positioned in the middle, you see that it doesn't look as good. It loses a bit of its natural balance. Or in this next shot, where I decided to put the camera very far away and I framed it so that me with the flashlight would be in one of the cross-section points. Those are the important points where you can position your subject and it will look good. You see how balanced everything looks and how aesthetically pleasing just by placing the objects on the certain lines or focal points? This also works for photography. Usually if I'm taking a portrait, the top line will cross my eyes, that's the important part, and that's how you frame a person in the picture. So we learned that in the rule of thirds by placing the subject or the object in one of the lines or one of the points, it creates this balanced feeling if used properly. There are other grids that might help you, and the next following one is just the centered one, where you focus in the middle point. That's where the eye naturally tends to go. So placing the subject in the middle creates this natural symmetry feeling, which makes it aesthetically pleasing. But now the common question is, when do you center your subject and when do you don't center it and place your subject maybe in one of the lines? And that's a good question, and it really depends on two things: the context and the balance. Remember the photo that I showed you of me and my friends badly composed? Well, after thinking about it, I understood that he decided to put us in one of the points in the rule of thirds grid instead of centering us. But if I expand this picture with a little bit of Photoshop, doesn't this look a bit better? That's because the context is just a normal group photo. The background is pretty, but that's not the other focal point. We see that us being in the bottom focal point has nothing to do with the background on the opposite focal point. Let me give you a good example. So this one is me and my partner sitting in the car, and we're looking to the right. And so I decided to frame and move the camera a bit, shift the camera, so that we're not centered and we are instead on the left. So because we're on the left and we're looking at the right, we're looking at the sunset, it all feels more balanced. It tells a story, it connects us viewing that direction, and what's on that direction, there's the sun. And all of a sudden putting ourselves in the first vertical line of the rule of thirds makes sense because there's a context. Whereas the group photo, the focus was supposed to be just on us and not on the beach. That's why this picture, when you look at it, it really feels unbalanced. The context is not there. We're not looking away there. We're just looking at the camera as a normal group photo. That's why it looks much better if you center it. Let me give you other examples. There was a phase where I was just doing a lot of Photoshop art, and I always took into consideration the rule of thirds. So in this case, I'm grabbing my face and I'm looking at the left. And we see that because I'm looking at the left, I have to be positioned a little to the right, so I give more space to the left because I'm facing that direction. This next one, where I'm clone myself sitting in two chairs, you see that the first horizontal line of the rule of thirds crosses our heads. And the two vertical lines crosses each of our bodies. That's why this picture looks so dynamic and so balanced and so aesthetically pleasing. The same goes for this one, where I'm on top of a hay roll. The first horizontal line crosses my body, and the bottom one crosses the hay roll. So if usually there's a context or a person is looking at this direction, then maybe I should be positioned more here. It feels balanced. Instead, if I was positioned like this and I look this direction, it feels off. It doesn't feel balanced. And right now, as I'm talking to the camera, it just makes sense to be symmetrical and I'm in the middle. But at the end of the day, most importantly, the golden rule or just being center, symmetry and all that, they are just rules. You learn about them, you can use them, but sometimes you don't have to follow them. For example, on this shot that we saw previously, the horizon line doesn't really match with one of the rule of thirds grid. But I really wanted to emphasize the negative space on top because I'm looking at the sunrise and I'm so at awe and like super mesmerized. That's why I decided to position the camera and angle it a little bit more up just to make that more clear. And I think it's a good shot. As long as you're thinking about the framing and it makes sense within the context and it feels right, then you're doing it correctly. Now that you've learned these two fundamental topics, the distance and how you frame stuff, next time you're shooting, drawing, or even taking a video, try and think about these things. Best of luck. Most of the times you see shots angled like this, where the camera is at the same level as the subject. But this lesson we will explore what happens if we raise the level of the camera so high or lower the angle. For the most natural feeling shot, you want to just put the camera at about the same level of height as the subject. If you lower the camera a bit and pointing more upwards, you're using a low angled shot. There are many feelings that we can feel when looking at such a shot. And in the previous lesson where we covered why the subject should be centered or not, and it mostly depends on the context, the feelings you get when looking at a low shot also depend on the context. Because if the subject, me in this case, is higher in level above the camera, it feels like I'm more important. It even might give you the feeling of intimidation. With the right context, a lower angle could very well portray inspiration or awe. Here we see that the sky is so colorful and beautiful that it really, within this context, within this frame, it makes sense to just put the camera a little lower and look upwards. But if you're the subject and I raise the camera a little higher and pointing a bit down, we're using a high angle. And there's a lot of feelings that could be portrayed. One of them inferior or vulnerable when we see these shots, as the subject is literally lower or inferior in height compared to the camera. With the right context, having the subject not looking at the camera, it even evokes feelings of detachment, like you're even just observing them. In this shot, actually in this room, I was doing a little bit of embroidery and I decided to put the camera really high up, pointing down. When I don't look at the camera, like I don't even acknowledge it, it feels like when you look at this frame that it feels like you're really just observing someone. People often make this rookie mistake when they're taking a picture with a high angle out of laziness. What it accidentally does to pictures of dogs or children is that it makes them feel inferior. Just crouching down and having the same level of the camera as to your subject makes it feel much more natural. Just doing this extra step makes a whole difference in the angle and the feeling that the shot conveys. The Dutch angle is when the camera isn't really leveled. It gives this really an easy feeling and it creates all this tension. It's often used when the character has some psychological distress. I personally don't really use this because my stories don't really involve these kind of topics, but here you go. This is something you can use. Now, if the camera is at the same height as the subject, we give this subconscious feeling of equality. It is the most relatable one, the most natural feeling one, and it is the most easy to connect with each other. It doesn't impose dominance or vulnerability. And hopefully for a course like this, that's the message I'm trying to transmit you. That's why I chose, for all of the courses, this height and this angle, because it really is the most natural looking one. With that said, angles are another tool in the box that you can use when you first think about something. You think about what feeling you want to portray, and then you position the camera with the distance and now with the angle. And this concludes the framing part of this course. Basically, everything you need to do to set up the camera, where you set up the camera, which angle, that's the framing part. From here on, we'll go even beyond the frame. What I mean by that is, how can we manipulate stuff within the frame to make your viewers look at a certain area? With that said, have fun shooting with different angles, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Now that we covered the height, distance, and angle, in the following lessons we'll cover how to direct the viewer's eyes on if you want to focus over here, or here, or here, or here. And first of all, I'm going to show you a bad example. Something one you don't take into consideration. I took this photo a long time ago, random photo, and at the time I thought it was cool. But now that I look at it, at the time, I thought this was a really cool picture because of all the people going around here, here. At the time, I thought this picture was really nice because it had so much depth and people here and the right in the middle just walking. But there are so many distracting elements. There are so many lights. First of all, these two vertical lines on the right, they are really distracting your eyes because am I supposed to look here in the middle? Am I supposed to look here on the right? Or am I supposed to look at this word here on the left, top left with all the lights? It is really distracting. There are so many elements that are pushing my attention that I don't know at the end where to look. Where is the subject and where should I look at? So the first thing you want to do is to understand where the subject is or what do we want to focus on. And the step after is to look at the negative space. What is around the subject? That is also very important. And in this specific lesson, we'll talk about lines. Lines are created naturally through the background and we can use them to our advantage when composing a shot. For example, in this picture in the mountains, I just finished hiking and I positioned myself in the middle. This is where the focus usually is, where the eyes tend to focus first. So what helps is what's actually behind me. We have these beautiful mountains and see if I draw these natural lines, they all coincide to the middle. These are called leading lines that are naturally made in the background that tend to converge into a single point, and if your subject is in that single point, it just makes it so aesthetic that the eyes naturally just converge in the middle and you know immediately where to focus. And maybe something less natural is this picture shot in the train, and we see the repetition of the seats. They make this natural line that coincides in the middle, also where I am, the subject. It creates symmetry, and the leading lines guide us to where to look at. And opposed to the other picture, there are so many distracting elements. I don't even know where to look at. These ones are really obvious, and that's a big major point to why they are good shots and why they are well composed. Another point I would like to emphasize is the horizon line. Usually in a portrait, or if the subject is human, we don't want lines crossing our head because it is just a distracting element. And how you do that better is just by lowering yourself or a little higher, so you can change where the horizon line will cross. I really hope you can understand the power that leading lines can have within the frame. It leads the viewer somewhere specific, and it makes it so much more obvious where the person should look at. It makes it, therefore, just much more aesthetically pleasing. If the viewer knows where to focus on, there's less confusion. The less confusion there is, the more aesthetically pleasing it is. For drawing, it is easier to create these leading lines. For photography or even video, you have to frame and think about what's in the background, because you cannot create these things. You have to look out for them. With that said, try them, they're really fun, and best of luck. Depth is a great way to separate the frame into different parts and makes it more digestible to interpret the frame. Essentially, you can categorize your frame into three parts: the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. For example, the foreground would be the computer that's more close to you. The middle ground would be where I am. And the background, which is the wall behind me, isn't that far away, but it's considered the background because it's what occupies this space. It just creates a bit more depth. It creates this interesting factor. It gives more to digest or more to see and interpret. And if done well, for example, this shot, I'm just in the middle with my bike, and you can see the foreground elements. There are leaves from the corn plant, and the foreground already tells us something about the environment. It kind of frames me in a way and leads me to focus what's in the middle. The middle ground, it's me with the bike, and the background is just the weather and what's in the background. But the foreground element really glues everything together. It puts the attention in the middle and gives also a bit of detail to what's around me. Not all shots need all three levels of depth, but adding them will create more interesting parts to your story and how you show it. Now, another way to create focus is by using shapes or frames. Doors and windows are naturally good shapes to shoot through. For example, I took the extra work to put the tripod with the camera outside and position it where I would be. And this frame immediately makes it obvious to where to look at. I'm right in the middle, and it frames me. It's a frame within a frame. It gives more context that I'm in a house, and it also adds that depth, the interesting factor. And I think this turned out to be one of my favorite shots. The extra work to go beyond the natural shot and to add more depth is always worth it. It adds always some interesting elements. It tells a bit more of the story. It creates more context. And more importantly, it leads the person to know where to look at. With that said, have you ever tried putting the camera outside or the perspective of your drawing in another way? This might give a little more interestingness and might frame and glue everything together to tell your story in a better way, With that said, best of luck. Light draws attention to where you point it at. So once we have the camera in a certain distance and a certain frame, the light can help also glue together and emphasize what you want to show by making it the brightest part of the frame. In this example, it was a dark corridor, but I positioned myself, or I mean the ghost, in the middle of the corridor where the light was shining the brightest. This created a bigger contrast between me and the background, which made it immediately obvious where to look at, and it glued the picture all together. It was a smart move. And here in this shot, we see that the whole classroom is just dark. And me with my flashlight was the only source of light basically over there. And because of that, our eyes immediately go to where the brightest spots are. And these bright spots are exactly where you want the focus to be. Remember that picture I showed in the last lesson? I had all these distracting elements, all these lights, and I didn't even know what the subject was. I just shot the picture randomly and I thought it was good. I didn't even know where to look at. There was too many distractions, lights here, lights there. It was not that good. But here, you know exactly where to focus. And of course, the way I positioned this circular light was for me to be in the center where the focus would go and not over there or there, and creates a certain balance, and I think it glues the whole frame together. And the opposite is also true. The light, if behind you, it creates a certain contrast with a little backlighting, and the focus again tends to go over there. So remember, if everything is dark, the first thing that stands out is where the light is. Before I actually framed this one, it was a different time of day and there was a little bit more light outside. And you see, it doesn't look quite as nice as when it's nighttime and the only source of light is where you want to focus on. Before, everything was bright, so you didn't know exactly where to look at. But now, where it's night and I can put a light inside and the only part that's lit up, it's in the middle, immediately the eye knows where to focus on, and the shot becomes more aesthetically pleasing for that reason. Light, if used correctly, can make a wonderful tool for composition. Use it to your advantage. With that said, have you ever thought about the time of day you're shooting and how the light could be advantageous to maybe a place indoors or just outside, maybe like the last one, waiting a bit more to get darker so you get more contrast between lighting. Have fun, experiment, and I'll see you in the next one. In the previous lesson, we talked about the contrast between light. In this lesson, we will talk about contrast between color. It is another tool that can play a significant role if used correctly to grab attention within the frame. For example, in this shot, this whole area is bright. And specifically on that day, I decided to wear something more dark, something that would contrast with what's in the background. And really quickly, you can see that I really stand out within wherever I was in that place. And the focus was more on me. Now in contrast, if the focus is on something else, now in this shot we have this beautiful sunrise with all of these colors, it wouldn't make sense if I use a neon pink or green shirt that would only compete attention with me and the background. Instead, I decided to wear something dark that would just stay away from what you want to focus on. You see me all in dark and everything else is in beautiful bright colors. This contrast makes it more aesthetically pleasing instead of having the colors being another distracting element. Color, if used correctly, just like light, can be another important element to guide the viewer, to know where you should look at. With that said, if you're going on a photo shoot or if you're drawing something, the color you choose might actually play a big role on how the shot feels. And pay attention to where the focus is. If you want the subject to be really in focus, then make it contrast with what's behind. If you want the focus to be on something else, make the subject wear something more dark or more discreet. With that said, try the colors and best of luck. In modern days, everything is shot at 16 by 9 at 30 frames per second or even 60 sometimes. This is something we're really used to. But what if we change the aspect ratio? And what about the frame rate? Whoa, doesn't this feel a little different? Aspect ratio is the relationship between the width and the height of the frame. Because nowadays we have powerful phones where everything we see on the computer is with 16 by 9. We're so used to this, we think this is the most modern thing. But if we change it up to 4 by 3, on the other hand, it feels nostalgic and even intimate. The boxier shape, it goes back to the classic television days where it was everything in this area. All of my childhood cassette videos were shot in 4 by 3. That's why in my videos, every time I talk about memories or I want to evoke this nostalgic feeling, I tend to use a different aspect ratio. I cut from what is the modern 16 by 9 to 4 by 3. And sometimes I even lower the frame rate because having a frame rate that's a bit choppier, a bit lower, gives the sensation of like these memories you had that you don't quite remember 100%. And that's how you kind of look at them back then. It gives this old feeling. So in this lesson, having just talked about the frame itself, maybe it is something that you might want to try and utilize. If used well, you can evoke the correct emotions and it visually tells a story better than just using the normal aspect ratio. With that said, maybe try, maybe don't, but best of luck. And the most important aspect of attention that I don't see other people actually referring that much is movement. This is really internally biological wired for generations for survival, and it is also vital to what you pay attention within this video. If the frame contains excessive, distracting movement, it confuses the viewer. It makes it unclear where their focus should be. This is exactly the opposite of what we want. If everything is still and only one thing is moving, that moving subject or object will get all the focus, while the whole frame looks pleasing. This is why shaky handheld shots are so hard to watch. I try to keep shaky handheld shots up to a minimum, but sometimes there's no other way. Here I had to actually cut this shot out of the video because it was just too shaky. Shakiness, if used moderately, can create a lot of tension, a lot of suspension, but if you're just trying to show something, putting the camera somewhere, using a table, a chair, or a tripod, and making it still makes everything much better. For example, in this shot, everything is still except for the electric that's going down. With the symmetry and the rule of thirds, it makes everything that much more aesthetically pleasing. You know immediately where to look at because that's the only thing that it's moving in this frame. There is this shot where I fix the camera at the back side of the car, and when placing it fixed, it creates still areas in the frame and predictable moving places, making the shot that much more pleasant to watch. If it was a shaky handheld shot, this wouldn't have the same effect. So you see here, all the benches and everything that were inside, they're all the same place. They're really predictable, and everything outside is what's moving, just like in the car. That's what made this shot truly one of my favorites. And of course, just like light, just like color, the opposite is true. So if everything is moving around and in the middle there's one thing that's completely still, that will get the most of the focus. So for example, here I was at the airport, and by complete luck, of course I didn't direct any of these people. I just decided to go in the middle of the frame. I would go look at the screen, point at the screen, and then get out. And exactly at the point where I was looking in the middle of the screen, just being still, just looking, everyone was moving left to right or right to left, which made the shot look that much better because he knew exactly where to focus on. I was in the middle, still, and everything else was basically moving around. This is truly an important aspect if you think about video. The change in position or movement really draws attention. It catches the attention and it leads to where the viewer should look at. Too many movements, too many distracting things happening at the same time doesn't make a shot look good. Usually the simpler, the better. Next time you're shooting around, think about this. Think about how you can frame. If you zoom in, maybe you can cut some of the distracting elements off, or you can go to a special place that there's not many people and have a specific angle that you want. That extra work of cutting the things off and putting the things that you want in focus makes a big difference in how you compose the photos, and that extra work makes it all worth it for the composition of the shot. Best of luck. Sometimes there are just things that we cannot control when we're shooting around or we're taking a picture. For drawing, that's a little bit different because you're in control what you put, where and how, but for photos and videos, that's not the case. For photos, it's actually much easier to correct for these mistakes, and for videos a little bit harder, but it doesn't mean that it is impossible. But still, you should always strive for the best composition in the first place. You cannot fix a bad photo, but you can only enhance a good photo into an excellent one. The same goes for video. A really bad handshake video will have no use, even if you try and fix the shaky video with all this digital stuff to make it more smooth. It won't. A bad shot is always a bad shot. You cannot fix it. But you can enhance a good shot into a really good shot. So there are shots that you already saw, and you might not even have noticed that there were some corrections made to it. Let me show you what I mean. So, for example, this snow shot, there were a lot of distracting elements, I thought. And in Photoshop, it is easier to remove them or change color. You see that there's less posts, there's less signs, there's less stuff in the background, and the focus, it goes into where we are at. Again, the leading lines and just the overall lighting makes sense in this framing. And by taking these distracting elements, it made a big difference to what made a good photo into an excellent photo. For video, you saw this shot. But what if I told you that the original shot looked like this? So the trick is to film at the same position a little bit longer. So the people on the right, they were just resting and they were walking down eventually, but I kept filming even when the electric wasn't there. and I use that information to mask it on top. And that way, I can make the shot seamless. And without the masking, with the people on the right, you see that it creates this competition between the people and the electric, where the viewer thinks, where should I see? Where should I look at? Should I look at the electric? But there's also people on the right. It creates this confusion. So by removing them, all of a sudden the focus turns everything into there, in the middle. That's where the focus should lead on. Making these small adjustments that sometimes you cannot control really does create a good shot into an excellent shot. And the same goes here at the beach. There is nothing in the background except for these two people in the left. And by just, again, the same technique, masking, using another part of the clip where they're gone, we just put them on top, mask, maybe use a bit of feather so it looks a bit more seamless. And all of a sudden the shot, the distracting element is gone and we can focus where we want to focus. Good composition at the end of the day is the distance you want to convey the information you want to convey. The focus should be where you want the focus should be. If there are too many distracting elements, the photo or video or artwork just doesn't become that good. So by fixing up these little tiny distractions, if possible, makes a big difference to how a shot feels and how professional it looks. With that said, if you have any shots that could be slightly improved, taking the extra time is always worth it. Best of luck. The best composed shots have a mix of all of these elements. First you have the distance, then the angle, then what focal length you're using, then you can use the light to focus where you want to focus, and the colors. And if everything is mixed together in a good way, then it makes the whole shot much better to look at. If many of these is new information to you, I understand that it might be a little overwhelming, but what I can advise you is to pick one technique, pick one variable, so the distance, and you practice with it. You see what you can do and change a bit here, there. And then once you feel comfortable, you try another aspect. Why not think about the rule of thirds or about centering the image? And once that's comfortable, why not incorporate an external light? It's these little things, these little step by step that you get more comfortable and you master these elements that you at the end can mix all of them together without really thinking about it. It just, sometimes it comes up naturally, but it only comes with practice. And to help you with this, I'm going to show you a beautiful video with well-composed shots. And I'm going to explain every shot, the composition type I use, and my thought process behind it. I would advise you maybe to look at it in one go without pausing, just to enjoy the shots, and then a second time where you actually pause and read what's behind the thought process, and maybe you can learn a thing or two. Also, I was born and raised in Portugal, and I wanted to show in this video the beauty of many parts that I grew up in. This video actually means a lot to me, and yeah, enjoy! I'm going to tell you that not even I, after doing it for years, do it perfect. I still make some mistakes. And what I wanted to do in this lesson is show you a picture or a video, and I'll give you some time to identify the mistake. See if you can spot it. So you probably already seen this clock shot in one of my previous lessons, and the mistake here that really bothers me is I didn't care about the background. I can see something there blurry with another color, and it just takes away the attention from the subject. It makes it confusing. I want to look at the clock, but something on the left, there's a blur, a blob of color, that if I just took a few seconds and took it off, it would have made the shot that much better. After doing so many portraits and abstract pictures, here I failed to put the tripod with the right angle and the horizon line crosses my head. If only I adjusted the angle a little bit more up or down, it would have made a big difference. This shot is a great one. It's just that I couldn't control when people go from left to right passing by in front of the car, and the movement itself creates a lot of distractions. Of course, I could have masked out, but with all the intricate details of the cars, it would have just taken way too long. So instead of masking, I just took a few fractions of moments that there was no movement in behind me. This one's a bit harder to spot. Maybe it doesn't really bother you, but for me, what it bothers is that I cut off the photo in one of the joint points. Anything that rotates and moves around our body, so shoulder, elbow, hands, ankles, it just feels weird when you cut them there. But I guess the attention's so much on the face that it doesn't maybe really matter. But if only I would have just put my hand a little bit higher. So this one's actually easily correctable, and it's kind of hard to spot, but the photo isn't completely straight. It is zero point 0.7 degrees kipped. When I first shot this and I posted my video and I rewatched it, I noticed afterwards, and it's something that's so small, but you just notice it when you correct it. Unless I'm going for an uneasy feeling, we have to correct for any crooked shots. So you see, even though I know these rules for ages, I still make them. But it's good to identify them and try and avoid them next time. I hope you learned something and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for taking this course. I hope you understand that by mixing and combining all of these tips together will raise the potential and how well composed the shots will look like. The best way to level up your skills is to actually get good feedback. So always feel free to share any shot, any artwork, or any video with us, and I check all of them. And if you want, I can also give some pointers, and feel free to ask any questions also in the discussion tab. Feel free to post a review, it really helps. I also created other courses about video and other aspects, feel free to check them out. I also post weekly videos on my YouTube channel with really detailed videography and storytelling. Feel free to check them out. With that said, thank you so much for taking this course and best of luck with your future projects. See ya!